Let's start with something uncomfortable, because uncomfortable truths tend to matter more than comfortable charts. Silver didn't just go up this year. It didn't merely outperform stocks, crypto, or real estate. At one point, silver briefly became one of the most valuable assets on Earth by market capitalization. That alone should make you stop scrolling. But what really matters is why it happened, where it happened, and who is quietly deciding the rules of this market while everyone else argues about price targets. Because this story is not about buy silver or don't buy silver. That's amateur hour. This story is about who controls reality when paper prices stop matching physical survival. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. Most people lump gold and silver together because they sit next to each other in the commodity section. That's lazy thinking. Gold is psychological. Gold is about trust, credibility, reserve status, and what backs a currency when faith starts leaking out of fiat systems. That's why central banks hoard gold. That's why China has spent decades building alternative gold infrastructure, exchanges, settlement corridors, and reserve narratives. Silver is something else entirely. Silver is not about trust in money. Silver is about control over the real economy. Silver is embedded inside solar panels, electric vehicles, military electronics, satellites, data centers, AI infrastructure, robotics, and advanced weapons systems. It is one of the best electrical conductors humanity has ever discovered. And here's the key difference from gold: when silver gets expensive, factories don't stop buying it. They can't. A jewelry buyer can wait. A central bank can delay. A hedge fund can rotate. A semiconductor fab cannot. That single fact changes everything. For decades, silver lived in a strange financial limbo. It was essential to industry but treated like a speculative sidekick to gold. Prices were kept low, volatility was tolerated, and paper markets grew far larger than physical supply. Why? Because cheap silver made the modern world cheaper to build. Solar transitions, electronics proliferation, defense systems, telecommunications. All of it quietly benefited from silver being abundant, liquid, and, most importantly, financialized. But financialization has a weakness: it works only as long as nobody asks for delivery. And that assumption just broke. If you want to understand what's happening now, forget Twitter charts. Forget price candles. Look instead at where silver is priced. In the Western system, silver's price is largely discovered on COMEX, the U.S. futures exchange. It's a paper market. Most contracts never result in physical delivery. They're rolled, netted, or settled in cash. Inside COMEX vaults, silver is categorized in two buckets. Eligible silver sits there but is not for sale. Registered silver is what's actually available to settle physical delivery if someone demands metal instead of dollars. Here's the uncomfortable number: registered silver on COMEX hovers around 120 to 130 million ounces, while annual global silver demand is roughly 1.1 to 1.2 billion ounces. Do the math. Less than 10% of annual demand is physically available for delivery in the system that supposedly sets the global price. This works only because most people never test the system. Until they do. Now set your eyes on the East. Shanghai's silver market operates differently. Prices there reflect actual physical delivery inside China. Not paper promises. Not hypothetical settlement. Real metal, stored, moved, consumed. Normally, prices between Shanghai and COMEX stay close. If one rises too much above the other, arbitrage traders step in. They buy where it's cheaper, sell where it's more expensive, and the gap closes. That's how markets are supposed to work. But recently, something snapped. At one point, physical silver in Shanghai traded around $78 an ounce, while COMEX silver sat closer to $72. A $6 gap. That is enormous by historical standards. Normally, a $1 spread is enough to trigger instant arbitrage. This gap didn't close. That tells you something critical: physical silver is no longer moving freely. Not because traders are stupid. Because supply is constrained where it actually matters. And when arbitrage breaks, price discovery dies. Why China's silver frenzy is not retail mania. Western commentary loves to dismiss what's happening in China as speculative madness. Videos of people rushing to buy silver bars. Crowds in Shenzhen. Retail investors scrambling. That framing misses the point. Yes, there is retail frenzy. There always is when trust in other assets collapses. But beneath that chaos is something more important. China stopped selling silver. Not publicly with a dramatic announcement. Not with a ban that would trigger headlines and retaliation. They reclassified it. Silver was quietly moved under dual-use export control rules, the same legal framework used for materials with both civilian and military applications. Once a material enters that category, exports are no longer automatic. They require approval. Approval that can be delayed, denied, or selectively granted. On paper, China can say, "We're not banning anything." In practice, they now decide who gets silver and who doesn't. That's not speculation. That's leverage. If this sounds familiar, it should. China ran this exact playbook with rare earth elements. A decade ago, rare earths were obscure. Most people couldn't name one. China controlled the refining, declared them strategic, imposed export controls, and watched the world panic. The US, Europe, and Japan suddenly realized that rebuilding non-Chinese supply chains would take years, sometimes decades. Silver is worse. Rare earths are specialized. Silver is everywhere. And unlike gold, silver supply is largely inelastic. Roughly 70 to 80% of silver production comes as a byproduct of mining other metals like copper, lead, and zinc. You can't just mine more silver because prices went up. You have to mine more of everything. That makes silver structurally dangerous in a supply-constrained world. When silver recently dropped sharply on Western screens, margin hikes, forced liquidations, paper longs wiped out, many people thought the story was over. But here's the tell, Shanghai kept buying. Same hour. Same metal. $10 difference. Paper markets were selling contracts. Factories were securing survival. Those are not the same activity. And when those two realities diverge long enough, the paper price eventually has to answer to the physical one. Not the other way around. At this point, it should be clear this is not about whether silver hits $90 or $150. Those are trader questions. This is about who controls the inputs of modern civilization. Energy transition? You need silver. AI infrastructure? Still need silver. Military hardware? More silver. Electronics? Need lots of silver. Gold underwrites trust. Silver underwrites function. And China remembers something the West forgot: if your economy depends on a material you don't control, someone else will eventually weaponize it. They learned that lesson the hard way in the 1930s. They are not repeating it. Because once paper markets lose authority over physical reality, things don't normalize. They reprice violently, politically, and asymmetrically. And history is very clear about who pays for that adjustment. Let's get something straight right away. What you're watching in silver is not a bubble in the traditional sense. Bubbles are about excess optimism. This is about structural dependence colliding with constrained supply. That distinction matters, because bubbles pop and disappear. Structural shortages don't. They mutate. They get managed. They get rationed. And eventually, they get politicized. One of the most confusing things for people right now is the extreme volatility. Silver surges. Then it crashes 10% in a day. Then Shanghai trades at a premium anyway. Then COMEX raises margins. Then physical inventory vanishes. Then prices diverge again. To most retail investors, this looks chaotic, but it's not. This is what happens when paper leverage is forced to reconcile with physical scarcity. Margin hikes are not price discovery tools. They are crowd control tools. They flush leveraged players out of the system so the exchange doesn't face delivery risk. That's why paper silver can collapse while physical silver becomes harder to find. This isn't manipulation in the cartoon villain sense. It's systemic self-preservation. When exchanges fear delivery stress, they change the rules to reduce participation. And that tells you everything you need to know. Here's a brutal truth most investors don't want to hear: industrial buyers do not care about your technical levels. A solar manufacturer doesn't ask whether silver is overbought. A defense contractor doesn't wait for RSI to cool off. A data center doesn't hedge its silver exposure based on YouTube sentiment. They secure supply. And when supply becomes uncertain, they oversecure it. That's how shortages accelerate. Not because demand explodes overnight, but because risk tolerance collapses. Once buyers fear not getting silver at all, price becomes secondary. Availability becomes primary. This is why Shanghai pricing matters more than COMEX volatility. Shanghai reflects fear of non-delivery, not speculation. Now let's talk about the United States. The US is not out of silver. That's not the issue. The issue is that the US does not control the refining and processing choke points that turn ore into usable metal at scale. Mining is only the first step. Refining is where leverage lives. And over decades, the West outsourced that leverage in exchange for cheaper costs, higher margins, and smoother quarterly earnings. It worked. Until it didn't. Rebuilding domestic refining capacity is not like flipping a switch. It's capital-intensive, environmentally contentious, slow, and politically messy. The rare earth experience proved that. Silver will be no different, except the stakes are higher because silver touches far more sectors. This means the US response will not be immediate. It will be gradual, fragmented, and reactive. And markets hate that. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this entire story is inflation. Most people think inflation is about prices rising because governments print money. That's only half the story. The other half is input inflation, when critical materials quietly become more expensive or harder to access, forcing costs through the system whether policymakers like it or not. Silver doesn't just sit in vaults. It sits inside things. When silver prices rise structurally, you don't see a silver inflation line item on your receipt. You see it embedded in energy costs, electronics prices, military budgets, infrastructure spending, and capital expenditures. It's stealth inflation. And it's far harder to reverse. At this point, some people will ask the obvious question, so should I buy silver? That's the wrong question. The right question is, what does silver tell you about the world you're living in now? It tells you that paper abstractions are losing credibility faster than most people realize. It tells you that strategic materials are being reclassified not as commodities, but as policy instruments. And it tells you that the global economy is moving away from frictionless globalization toward managed scarcity. Silver is just one of the first signals to flash red. And what comes after the signal? Historically, when commodities like silver behave this way, one of three things happens. First, governments intervene. Export controls, subsidies, strategic stockpiles, industrial policy. That reduces volatility but increases politicization. Second, prices remain unstable for longer than anyone expects, flushing out speculators and concentrating ownership among those who actually need the material. Third, entire investment narratives shift. Markets stop asking, "What is this worth?" and start asking, "Who controls it?" We are already in phase 2. Phase 3 is next. Silver is not rising because people suddenly love silver. Silver is rising because the world is discovering who actually controls the machinery of modern life. When that realization hits critical mass, prices don't just adjust. Power does. And power, once it moves, rarely moves back quietly. This is not the end of the silver story. It's the moment the story stopped being about silver at all.